Welcome one, welcome all, welcome back. It's time for yet another edition of Politics by Jake, the original PB&J, none of that peanut butter and jelly stuff. And today we've got some definitions to talk about. This may sound dry, but I urge you to stick with me. So without further ado, let's get right into it, shall we? So, okay, let's, talk some more about definitions. Now, if you're going to be kind of waggish or take literary license, T.S. Eliot, for example, with regard to monarchy, that's one of the definitions I want to discuss. He says that, if you don't have a monarchy with a court, you really can't have good novels and things like that. Because, intrigue, right? Palace drama, things like that. And I think that's T.S. Eliot. But you get the idea on that. But to be reactionary means you really want to go way back. So we have, for example, this recent 1864 abortion law, and it's been repealed, but it won't take effect for 90 days. And the reactionary forces, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, I just kind of gave it away, but the reactionary forces in the Arizona legislature want to go to the courts and stop the law from taking effect. Katie Hobbs, the governor of Arizona, Democrat, she signed it, and so we have it. But 90 days to take effect, and it's going to be tried in the courts, and it'll be interesting to see what happens on that. But if you have a law like this that's from 1864, that's reactionary. So in other words, and consider now for a minute what I'm saying. Say in this case, and the 1864 abortion law is an excellent example, this is what this means. It's unavoidable. You have to own up to it if this is the way you think. You're going back to a relatively primitive science. You're going back to a time when science was primitive. It almost, you could argue, practically pre-scientific. And then you're opposing, which is really making the whole thing particularly obnoxious, those backward, undeveloped views on the people of today. That's reactionary, and that's where a lot of the Republican Party have traditionally called them conservatives, but they're not conservatives. They are reactionaries. It is a turning back of the clock for the United States. And while it's probably not going to go back to pre-1789, it's probably going to be pre-Civil War for a lot of them. And to go back as much as possible to the pre-Civil War Confederate. Moscow Marge Taylor Greene, she is from this. I've mentioned before, Rome, Georgia, which is where her constituency comes from. They were directly in the path of Sherman on his march to the sea, where he is said to have devastated Atlanta and particularly destroyed the Confederacy's ability to make war by just, wiping out and burning and destroying everything that was in his path. And Rome, Georgia was literally in the path of that march. And I always kind of have to wonder whether, and there's a neo-Confederacy, I don't want to call it neo-Confederacy because honestly, it never died away there. And that's a topic for another show. And, we'll go into that sometime. I'm just going to mention it in passing now. It's never died away. It's still there. And there's issues of economics. There's issues of political power. And it's interesting. We'll talk about it. I promise. But I wonder if there's some kind of thing with Marjorie Taylor Greene because she's particularly petulant and persnickety. Holy alliteration, Batman. Persnickety, petulant. But she is, and she talks about things from the Confederate point of view. And this is an example of reactionary. So in other words, what we're talking about is the Confederate States as they were in the Union. And, this is funny, too, because a lot of and you're having this problem with the Supreme Court. This dovetails with the recent decision, which is an abominable decision. I don't even see how it could have been done with regard to insurrectionists holding office that just recently happened. You're going back to times when all of these issues, they were decided by the Civil War, and they are reflected in the amendments, the Civil War amendments. And now, and this is where I get off, guys and gals, talking about history, if you don't know that these things were already taken care of, if you haven't been educated in school, and honestly, history taught in school is abominable. It's kind of that history called gun and trumpet history, where it just basically talks about wars and doesn't talk about much else. if you're going to do that, these things are going to recycle. It's one of Politics by Jake's premises that these same concepts recycle. And if you don't know that they have occurred before, when they occur again, you will not recognize them. And I just kind of have a suspicion that this is what it is with this and a lot of these things. All of these old issues that were decided by the Civil War coming up again, and you're having, and I'm thinking as I'm talking to you guys, maybe we ought to go through the decision on insurrectionists holding office. I don't know if that's going to be too much for you, but I've read the decision, I've read the objections. It was one of these stunning cases where all 9 justices agreed. And I think that you have to argue that all 9 justices are wrong. And one of the reasons they're wrong is because this is law that is so old, it falls under the category of res judicata and stare decisis, which respectively means, number 1, res judicata, the thing has been judged, and number 2, stare decisis, which means let the decision stand. So in other words, unless there's something extraordinary that has happened, and that's like, Martians have landed on Earth or something like that. The thing has been judged. Let the decision stand. Don't touch it. It's been judged. Leave it alone. And you have this extraordinary thing, and the 3 reactionary justices, the 3 or 4, were the most aggressive on this thing. They decided issues that were not before the court. And this is one of the things that the more reactionary justices, and you have to look at the Ketanji Jackson, and you have to look at the other justices as reactionary because they agreed with this decision and they allowed it to be a 9-0 decision. And so in other words, they threw us back to pre-Civil War times and they invalidated a constitutional amendment, which is extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. So I'll think about that. We may need to talk about that some more. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back again to talk to you about one of these little wrinkles that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of happiness for people who actually want to own a business or who have just started a business or who have been operating a business now for some time. It doesn't really matter. My guess is that you wanted asset protection. That's one of the reasons for starting a business. You wanted to grow wealth and you wanted to protect the wealth that you created, and you thought that a limited liability company or a corporation would be the way to do that. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? Do you want to know if there's any way to fix that? Go to www.jakelaw.me, that's JAKELAW.me, and watch my video where I talk about this very important thing, and then set up a time where we can have a phone conference or call me directly now at 573-454-1168. That's 573-454-1168. Call now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. So in other words, getting back to what I was talking about, the Confederate States as they were in the Union, as it was, meaning within slavery, no states' rights as were granted by the 14th Amendment. I'm talking about what examples of reactionary. And this, in my mind, is what makes the recent decision of the court on Section 3. And, of course, the 14th Amendment is a watershed between the 3 Civil War, pre-Civil War legal order. So outrageous because the Civil War and amendments and the Civil War orders are, you can't have slavery. No state can deprive you of your rights, which is an entirely different thing. My opinion is that most people don't know this. So let me just explain it. Pre-Civil War, the rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, only applied to federal issues. They did not apply to state issues. And one of the reasons why the 14th Amendment is called the New Birth of Freedom is because now those same rights apply to the states as well. And they didn't before. So that's the new birth of freedom. I suspect most people think that it was always the case, but it was not. So getting back to this, insurrectionists cannot be elected to federal government. And unfortunately, as I just said, and I know I go on about it, but it's just awful. It's been struck down by this judicial gang of the Supreme Court. Now, if the Supreme Court had been conservative, which is what they all like to style themselves as, and they love for the media to describe themselves as, legislatures too, they want to be styled as conservative. And this is particularly heinous, in my opinion. They would have said, we respect the 14th Amendment, Insurrection Clause 3. Trump has to go off the ballot. And you will note, by the way, that even in that awful, facile opinion in Trump v. Anderson, that's the case that invalidated Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. They wouldn't at all say that Trump didn't commit insurrection. When you read the case, it is noteworthy that that is completely absent. They wouldn't say that. The Colorado court had made the correct judicial determination on that, which is telling about both their judgment and their cowardness, that they would not do the right thing. They didn't have the guts to do the right thing. And instead, they did the opposite. They waffled. They hid behind legal technicalities, which is a favorite trick of legal positivists. And we're going to try to talk about legal positivism because I'm not sure exactly that you guys know what it is. Most people, I don't think, know. But it's a thing, and we need to know about it. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. So it's a favorite trick of legal positivists when they're up against a situation where the law doesn't negate what they want. Then how do you avoid that? For example, talking about the tricks they use. How do you evade the power of those laws that have been on the books since 1868? And that is the opposite, by the way, of what they all said that they would do when they got on the court. They all said in their confirmation hearings, they believed in stare decisis, which means let the decision stand, and res judicata, which means the thing has been judged, with the implication that you leave it alone unless Martians have landed on Earth and dogs and cats have started living together, real wrath of God stuff. But they didn't do that. They lied. They all lied in their confirmation hearings. They lied to Congress. And if we've seen before, why, we just have seen it similarly. We had the Voting Rights Act from the 1960s. It worked very well. And the Supremes come along and say, basically we hate that president. It's the wrong president. I'm engaging in a license right now. The wrong custom, tradition, and norm. And what we're going to do is we're just going to strike it down. Oh, because, by the way, racism doesn't exist anymore. Ha! Give me a break. It's ridiculous. They're lying. And that's just a number of cases where they do that. Now, not all of them are fascists, but apparently the majority are. So we have fascist judges, right? So that's another point for the Sullivan gun law in New York. The Sullivan gun law control legislation had been around for 120 years or more, and the court struck it down. Similarly, the court in Citizens United, and the case on that is Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, they held that unlimited amounts of money can come into politics. This is something that had also been banned for decades, maybe as long as a century before. So in the Supreme Court, there's no conservative majority of the Supreme Court. It isn't. It's rather a radical reactionary majority, but it gets worse than this. When does reactionary become fascist? It becomes fascist when the reactionary turns to violence. In other words, if I'm a reactionary and I can't get what I want under the system of majority vote, and it should be a simple majority, by the way, not super majorities, and legislative assemblies and the Electoral College and so forth, if I can't get it that way and I can't fake it in some other way, what do? I turn to violence. And that is the reason why January 6th is a watershed moment in American history. It is the reason January 6, 2021 is so critical, because that's the moment when large numbers, and one might say apparently respectable office holders, but they're not, and others went from being simple reactionaries to being fascists. And that means that the added dimension of violence has been added. And this includes, by the way, the people in the House and the people in the Senate who supported this or sought to support it in one way or another, even if they themselves didn't physically do violence to another person. The point is that they supported the ones outside who were doing it. You may remember Senator Hawley from Missouri being photographed, and actually there's video of it. You can go on YouTube and check it out, doing the raised fist salute, which is a kind of a fascist salute. He was supporting the violence. That's fascism. And they sought to use it as a springboard to their lies about fake electors. So in other words, they had a legislative insurrection and coup planned. where they intended to overthrow the government of the United States legislatively. But they also had the violence going on outside. So you can say that fascism can be described in the most reactionary action of the ruling class of, the boys, the bankers, the corporate executives, and so forth. That's one way to see it. They're the most reactionary, but they also have to rely on political terrorism. And political terrorism is what you're seeing from day to day. There's this character, and I'm talking about Donald Trump, but not only about Donald Trump. He's the one who, for a long time, has been the flashpoint for this, but there has been such a lying secret combination to put out these kinds of fabrication that goes back at least to 1997. In a recent podcast, Keith Olbermann talked about when he was going out with Laura Ingraham and what she told him. And basically, that says, I can issue public statements and slander citizens of, in this case, it was the city of New York or the state of New York, New York County, and I'm going to put out their names with the idea that I have a list of violent lunatics who will follow that. That's when fascism is the only term that suffices. There's just nothing else that works. So this is fascism. It's violence plus a reactionary program. It takes various forms, union busting and all the rest of that violence and reaction. And you have to say that that is what the Republican Party has devolved into. Because, what's the Republican Party program today? Well, the Republican Party used to be the three-legged stool that St. Ronnie the actor, also known to many as Ronald Reagan, referred to. He said, okay, you have number one, you have the economic conservatives. He said number two, you have the national defense conservatives. And number three, you have the social conservatives who are often inspired by religion. But what do you have today? You don't have any conservatives. What you have is reactionaries, mainly social issue reactionaries, and they've been made more extreme. And then they've added this element of violence to enforce this, practically by force of arms, by a violent mob, armed fascists, militias. So it's very convenient for these fascists to be called conservatives, but it's, completely not true. The argument could be made on the one hand, and I have another hand to make the argument against it, but this is the one hand, that America is the most anti-fascist country in the world. Our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the world's leading anti-fascist. The United States never allied with Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, or Japan. And of course, others did. The Soviet Union under Stalin and Molotov engaged in a 2-year alliance with Nazi Germany, and this practically dominated Europe and much of the world. And then there are those who became fascist, but the United States never did. Free elections, normal courts, these went on. And compared to so many other places where we see, like Vichy, France, under Marshal Pétain, fascist. Generalissimo Francisco Franco, Spain, fascist. Romania, the Iron God of Cutriano and others, Hungary became fascist, and so forth. But the United States did not become fascist, did not ally with fascist powers. And not only this, the United States did not appease fascism in the way that Sir Neville Chamberlain of Britain and Edouard Daladier of France did appease Hitler at the Munich Conference of September 1938. So, you media, hey, you guys out there, stop calling them conservatives. If you do, this is gaslighting. I'm sorry. And here's the Psychology Today definition of gaslighting. Gaslighting, I'm quoting here, is an insidious form of manipulation and psychological control. Victims of gaslighting are deliberately and systematically fed false information that leads them to question what they know to be true, often about themselves. They may end up doubting their memory, their perception, or even their sanity. Over time, a gaslighter's manipulations can grow more complex and potent, making it increasingly difficult for the victim to see the truth. And that's brainwashing. And what is that? Merriam-Webster says that brainwashing is this, and once again, quoting here, a forcible indoctrination to induce someone to give up basic political, social, or religious beliefs and attitudes and to accept contrasting regimented ideas. And that is also lying. And what is that? Well, lying is any statement made with the intent to deceive. And those three things are aid and comfort to a very dangerous enemy in the open field for no reason. and for no benefit. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back. And what I want to talk to you about now is something I call virtual invisibility. No, not literal comic book type invisibility. What I am talking about is a practical invisibility, a kind of invisibility where you cannot be seen, where your personal transactions are shielded, where your business affairs are hidden from prying eyes, where a purchase of certain items is far less likely to be able to be found out by persons who have an intent to do you and your loved ones harm, the kind that results in the preservation and the protection of your personal assets, your business assets, all for your benefit and the benefit of your loved ones, the ones you are doing all this for in the first place. That's virtual invisibility. Crazy, you say? No, this exists. It's a thing. Want to know more? Contact me either at my website, www.jakelaw.me, or call me direct at 573-454-1168. Do it now. Become invisible now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. Now, there are some people, the ones who come on television to talk about this. You have, for example, Professor Snyder of Yale, who seems to be dealing with platitudes. Nevertheless, people like Lawrence O'Donnell of MSNBC like him. I'm not exactly sure why. There's another one, Professor Ben Giat of NYU, certainly a better fighting spirit, Ruth Ben-Giat. She is an American historian and culture critic. She's a scholar on fascism and authoritarian leaders, and Ben-Giat is a history professor of history and Italian studies at NYU, that's New York University. But she's also one of them that really doesn't talk very much about the actual events of the 1920s and 1930s, right from Mussolini's March on Rome in October 1922, all the way to the fall of Berlin in May of 1945. The overthrow of Mussolini, September 8th, 1943, and the whole question of the Republic of Salo, which is known as the Italian Social Republic. And this was the one where, when Italy basically stepped out of the war, Hitler looked at this and he couldn't allow that to happen. And so the Republic of Salo was created, Mussolini was its head, and it was done basically at the behest of Hitler and the Nazis. And this was from mid-1943 and almost 2 years later, until the end of the war. So some of them, and once again, we're going along on this thing of definitions, some of them talk about autocrats, and it looks to me like the Democratic Party likes that. They want to use that term autocrats, but the problem is really that you should, to use the old expression, call a spade a spade. So in other words, if it's a fascist, you should call it that. But the problem is that it seems that the word is considered overly radical. But in my opinion, as I've explained to you, this sentiment is not accurate. Rather, what I've explained to you about the melding of reactionaryism to violence, which equals fascism, that is accurate. And I don't, therefore, think that autocracy is a really good and accurate way to describe this. An autocrat is usually a one-person ruler. It's a monarch. The two words are probably interchangeable. The classic example is the Tsar of all the Russias. His title in the 19th and the early 20th centuries was Autocrator Russii, which means the emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. And this is from one of the Russian czars who said this and was this, but he made this comment. He said, of course, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, of course, I'm an absolute and autocratic, and I don't get influenced by others. I certainly don't take orders from anybody. I do it all myself. But the thing is, this can only be one person, and very much with the stressing on the idea that you're not going to be pulled by the House of Commons or the House of Lords or by some other legislature, because there are none. And therefore, you're the autocrat. You're the one-man ruler. So everything that goes on in the government has to come through you. Okay, now let's take a look at the word authoritarian. Well, authoritarian is okay. But, there are so many authoritarians. You can say authoritarianism is nothing new. We've had all kinds of governments that have been authoritarian, Like you could think of Taiwan in the late 1940s until the coming of Chiang Ching-kuo, and he was the son and successor of Chiang Kai-shek. And Kuo had a very interesting and very strong idea of economic development, authoritarianism, which is more that it's not economic development and then authoritarianism. It's economic development authoritarianism. And this is rather more oppressive than the norm, I would say. I think the Chinese nationalists of the Google situation that they had where they basically have forced Google not to be free of expression. Russians have done similar and basically prescribed it. And Google went along with it because they valued the access to the markets in mainland China more than they did in taking a moral stand for freedom of expression. And this is quite typical of commerce. This is quite typical indeed. And this was the mainland. They could not allow, in their opinion, this was their argument, that they couldn't allow a freestyle political expression. And I would say, even if this idea is valuable enough, let's keep the term totalitarianism in place of authoritarianism. So totalitarianism is really closer to what we've got here in the United States, because if you're trying to dictate, for example, what pills you can take or whether you have control over your body, which is the whole issue, by the way, of many of the abortion laws, and certainly of the 1864 abortion law, or whether you can cross a state line to get medical care, whether you can get a perfectly normal and long-existing medical procedure, such as an abortion, which in the terminology is known as a dilation and curettage. If you're saying you can't have that, that's totalitarianism. And it was totalitarianism when the government wants to demand or interfere or meddle with every tiny little detail of your life, where you can go, what you can do, what you can say, what you can wear, what pills you can take, and so on. And in some ways, the Iranian regime has really strong totalitarian aspects. But none of these, I insist, none of these, again, are as effective as the term fascism and fascist to describe the regime of Mussolini starting in 1922 and then copied in many respects by Hitler and the Nazis. Hitler loved Mussolini. He looked up to Mussolini. He visited Italy and talked to Mussolini and was very excited about how fascism worked. So you could really say that Hitler really copied Italian fascism and just applied it to Germany. And, something that to my listeners may seem to be neither here nor there, the Italian justice system in the 1920s, before Mussolini came along, it was already largely anti-worker, anti-leftist, anti-socialist, ferociously so, in fact. But apparently this was not good enough for Mussolini when it came to certain aspects. So Mussolini, working with his justice minister, and this was a guy named Rocco, 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 he did the legal system, and it was called after the guy who created it, the Codice Rocco, or the Rocco Code, which is still there in part, although it's been amended, so it's not as harsh as it was. And it was these things, for example, that were copied by Hitler. For him, instead of the Rocco Code, it was the Volksgericht, or People's Court. And after the attempt to kill Hitler in July of 1944, the generals who had organized this would be put on trial and given death sentences. And the head judge of this was a guy named Roland Freisler. And you can see pictures of him on the internet where he's dressed up in the robes of a judge, but he's giving the Hitler's salute, the Nazi salute. So that's where this comes from. So be it in a secret place in the question of judges in the judiciary, the German regime, largely a copy of what Mussolini did in other areas. It's not quite the same thing, but in some of these, it is okay. So there we are, and once again, that's fascism. And, you've got Israel and the whole language of, the whole issue of language there. Israel thinks it has to bomb Rafah back to the Stone Age. So there's Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and some news agencies. They're calling them ultra-conservative. And I guess it comes to the fact that we have terms of the media. They really want to avoid this word fascist. And I don't avoid it at all. Here at Politics by Jake, We call a fascist, and we believe we know what it is, and I've just explained it to you. So they talk about them as being orthodox, and somehow it's something beyond that. So they call it ultra-orthodox, or even ultra-conservative, because the other one here, not a happy camper. Ben-Gvir says, why this Israeli attack on Isfahan, Iran, overnight, one missile. I mean, this is weak. This is unstable. This is nowhere near enough. This is the same Ben-Gvir who says that if you have overcrowding in your prisons, what do? Execute a bunch of Palestinian inmates. Look, this is the guy you want to call an ultra-conservative? Really? I'm sorry. I'm afraid he's passed over into the land that we're talking about now. He's passed over into Stormtrooper Junction. See, once again, and I just want to make this clear because it's so important, once you have this kind of reactionary stuff that melds the reactionary with violence, I'm so sorry, that's fascism. And that's, generally speaking, once again, getting back to Israel, you have the armed settler movement in the West Bank in particular. It qualifies for that. You have these things like armed raids of the Palestinian villages where you drive the people out. This is crazy. This is clearly an example of fascism. So again, with all this talk about definitions, which I think people really need to hear, I'm really urging you to do something to make them stop calling fascist conservative. There's a wonderful German term. I'm not going to state it because you know how German terms are. When you try to make something look like it's harmless and it's not, that's what's going on here. There is an attempt to present things that are extremely dangerous. In other words, conservative, reactionary, fascist, as being harmless. And, you know, it's got to stop. And I urge you to speak out on this. And I will support you here at Politics by Jake. And why do it? I mean, why? Tell me why you would concede, now that I've explained this, okay? And you know what it is, that fascism is the merging of reactionary political thought and ideals and actions with violence. That's fascism. This being the case, why concede this kind of an advantage to a dangerous, brutal enemy in the open field? And that's what we're talking about. And they're out there. They are domestic enemies, domestic terrorists in the United States. What are you getting for this? Tell me. You think it makes you more respectable? You think for 1 minute it'll save you when they come for you, if they are allowed to be fostered and to grow? I can tell you it won't. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back again to talk to you about one of these little wrinkles that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of happiness for people who actually want to own a business, or who have just started a business, or who have been operating a business now for some time. It doesn't really matter. My guess is that you wanted asset protection. That's one of the reasons for starting a business. You wanted to grow wealth, and you wanted to protect the wealth that you created, and you thought that a limited liability company or a corporation would be the way to do that. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? Do you want to know if there's any way to fix that? Go to www.jakelaw.me, that's JAKELAW.me, and watch my video where I talk about this very important thing, and then set up a time where we can have a phone conference, or call me directly now at 573-454-1168. That's 573-454-1168. Call now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. So, all right, let's talk about a couple of other definitions here. There are some who want to say that nationalists, and this will be of interest to you, I think, nationalists or Christian nationalists or white Christian nationalists are the enemy. And I would say, I don't think this is a good choice at all. I think this is a very bad choice, as a matter of fact, because you want to describe the enemy as being an object of contempt and execration, right? And if you're doing this stuff, if you're doing this work here in the United States, there are a lot of white people around, right? There are still a lot of white people, even with the growth of minorities. So why gratuitously attack them, I would ask? They're not going to understand you when you say this. They're going to think, what is this white OG? I'm white the last time I looked. Wait a minute. I would say leave Christ out of it. You can't blame Christ for these people. I've often said, and have for years, that I don't think they're Christians anyway. I think they're pagans. I think they're apostates. I think they're heretics. There was one woman of the jurors, interestingly, in New York, saying that Trump was the negation, the opposite of everything that she thought of as Christianity. And yeah, I agree. I think Trumpism is a Christian heresy. But why paper that over by calling a maggot a white Christian nationalist? And I'm glad I remembered. Nationalist, the word nationalist. What's wrong with that? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you support your country, in many ways to do this, but it's not going to be necessarily bad. And once you've said white Christian nationalists, in some part that you have attacked the majority of the people in this country. And I say, don't do it. This is stupid. Christian nationalists? Oh my God, that's a disaster. Stop. Again, these people are fascists. And when you say you haven't offended anybody in the United States, with the exception of like the George Lincoln Rockwell set and David Duke of the Ku Klux Klan, but David Duke was a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan at one time, and I suppose that they still exist. But generally, other than that, you call these people fascist. Oh, and by the way, the Ku Klux Klan, in my opinion, prototypical fascist organization. Hitler loved the Klan. But generally, these are the people you call fascists. This is scientifically and it's historically accurate. And it does not put you in a position of seemingly attacking anybody who's white, who's a Christian, or a nationalist. And of course, indeed, there are lots of good people. Come on now. There are lots of good people who are all three of these things. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily the crazies that want to have a theocracy or the dominionists or anything of the kind. They're just normal white Christian patriots. And you might say no, but some people, they want to strut and they want to preen themselves. It's true. They want to be holier than thou. So they come up with white Christian nationals. But I say this, don't do it. It's just not effective. It's not going to be popular. Just stay away from that. Okay. Now, another definition I want to talk about or reiterate, because I talk about things on this show a lot, and I think I've talked about this before, but we're going to do it again, people. We're going to go for another ride because repetition really helps. If you say it once, you're not necessarily going to remember it. A lot of times I need 3 or 4 times when I meet a person to finally remember, put the face with the name. So repetition helps, and I don't think that unusual either. So let's talk about populism. Populism can be accurate, and the point to make here, the distinction to make is the way it's used. It's not accurate. So, okay, there are basically 2 kinds of populism, 2 kinds, and the one is really the opposite of the other. This is interesting. They're really kind of inimical to each other, and that's just another way of saying they're enemies to one another philosophically. They're opposed to one another. On the one hand, you have cultural populism, okay? And cultural populism I think of sometimes as a kind of counterinsurgency. It's designed to dupe and deceive working people like you out there in my audience. Many of you are working people. And cultural populism tries to persuade you that somehow the big problems in life can be reduced to cultural issues. For example, that somehow transsexual athletes who started off as men are going to be competing against women, and that somehow this is a threat to civilization. Well, I don't think it's a threat to civilization. I mean, you tell me. The question is, does some transsexual swimmer of the type that we've seen competing against women, does he have hydrogen bombs? Does he have atomic bombs? Because, I have kind of always been of the opinion that the real threats to the country are armed with nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. So cultural populism, and there's a lot of these issues, they're called wedge issues. They're called more pejoratively, which is, kind of sarcastically and negatively. They're called rube bait, sucker issues. My race is good, your race is bad. This is cultural populism. This is exactly what Hitler said. And you have his blood and soil narrative. And you have Trump saying this also when he talks about the border and how the people coming over it are going to pollute, the standing order. This is blood and soil. It's exactly the same thing. It's cultural populism. Don't be fooled. Mussolini, getting back to Italian fascism, Mussolini, by the way, he was not so much this way. Mussolini was kind of a rejuvenated Roman Empire type of guy. He was basically saying, we're Rome, we're the state, we're the new Roman Empire. So there was more of this historical element in it. But for Hitler and for quite a few others, it's the cultural aspect. And the Nazi daily newspaper, it has an interesting name. Most people wouldn't think of this as being anything more than coincidental, but the name of it was Der Volkischer Beobachter. And Der Volkischer Beobachter, it means there's not exactly a word in English for Volkischer, but the closest thing to it would be the folksy, or maybe you could say the folkish, and Beobachter means observer. So it's basically the folksy observer of current affairs. There's no, like I said, there's no real English word for that, but you get the idea, and it means, this is what it means. And this kind of came upon me all of a sudden. I didn't used to think of it this way myself, but it means the cultural. It means the ethics. It means the cultural characteristics of being a German, the heart and soul of Nazism. And again, to be a nationalist. And the main thing that we are doing in order to defeat Trump and to defeat fascism, and if you go around spewing right Christian nationalism, left and right, not effective, not effective. These people are fascists. And once again, by avoiding this, you have not offended anybody. When you say fascist or fascism, you've not really offended anybody. You're avoiding people who say they're Christians. You're avoiding people who say they're nationalists. You're avoiding people who say they're religious, in the sense of saying, hey, you can't call me that. No, we're not calling you that. Unless you are, actually. Now, cultural populism is that. What's the alternative? And there's another kind of populism, and it's called economic populism. And economic populism, this is precisely what you need. I'm an economic populist. Politics by Jake runs on a plank of economic populism. And what I say is, I want an economy which is run for working people, not for Wall Street hedge fund hyenas, private equity parasites, and others. The purpose of economic populism is this, that the economy should not be run for the benefit of this elite. The casino economy, the parasitical speculators, and others. It needs to cater to the needs and the wishes of the broad masses of working people, especially industrial workers, farmers, miners, tech. High tech goes into this, and people like this. This is the main thing. And this is what you see when you want to cut child poverty, right? Is to introduce an earned income tax credit, which is refundable and which is going to give people an extra $200 or $300 a month per child, right? And you saw this during COVID. And you know what happened? It cut child poverty in half. So this is economic populism. These are the goals of a real economic system. Well, I mean, when I say that, I mean, I think what the real economic system, the way it should be, it deserves all of our support. It deserves for everybody to be for something like this, not an economy made for the casinos, not for the billionaires, not for the money power, not for the corporate fat cats, not for the hedge fund hyenas, etc. And maybe there's another thing here too. Let's talk about progressive. Now, there were progressives in Lafayette, Wisconsin after 1900, certainly the Populist Party in America in 1872 to 1910. Wall Street was against the Populist Party. It was a protest movement against Wall Street and the gold standard. You've heard that saying that mankind shall not be crucified on a cross of gold. That's where it comes from. That's a populist credo. The populist price of commodities that farmers were selling, and this is the kind of the genesis of it, was constantly declining. And the owner, what he had to pay back, the owner is a burdensome value of what he had to pay back, and he had to pay it back in gold. And the farmer it threatened to destroy him. And this is called the crisis of 1870 to 1910. It went along a long time. And the populists were quite a threat to the two-party system, very significant. And of course, they fell prey to cultural populism, which is the other kind of enemy, inimical. Remember when I said that? Inimical kind of populism. They got into forms of racism. In other words, it devolved. Economic populism devolved. It went reactionary. It fell backwards because they got into forms of racism, for example. They got into forms of xenophobia. And that's what killed them when they traversed, that is to say, when they crossed over into this cultural populism. See, these things are things. I know you don't know them. This is one of the reasons why Politics by Jake exists. I appreciate you listening to this because, maybe it's not as exciting as talking about the details of the January 6th attempt to overthrow the government of the United States. But if you're going to exercise the sacred franchise of the vote, you have to know who the players are and you have to know what the concepts are. And people don't. And that's one of the reasons I'm taking the time to talk about it now. There are many things that have existed before, as actually I said before, that you don't know about, but they come around again. And there tends to be this statement, maybe you've heard it, when people philosophically talk about eternity as being one eternal round. It's really kind of, in other words, it just goes around and around all over and over again, and things just recycle. Interesting point of view. We're not really here to discuss that, but it's kind of the same thing in politics. It's one eternal round. The same concepts, they may lie dormant for decades. They may have a life, and then they lie dormant for decades. And then they come around again. And if you don't know history, you don't know that this has already happened. And in many cases, like the Civil War amendments, these things were decided by the Civil War. And if you go back to pre-Civil War issues, this is the dead hand of a dead law, and it gives you nothing. It has already been dealt with, and this is perhaps the tragedy of American life and the tragedy of the world. And that's why we're going through a lot of this stuff, because people don't know, they don't study, and this isn't, I'm not coming down on you guys, not being negative, but you're not taught the proper thing, in my opinion, in the schools. And of course, I wouldn't be the first one to say that, but as far as history is concerned, this is crucial. It's just as crucial as quantum physics, just as crucial as rocket science, because if you don't know these things, you're going to have to suffer through them again. You're going to have to go through them again, and you won't progress. So the progressives, of course, were not so much in the Nebraska area of the Corn Belt and the Grain Belt, but this is, again, Wisconsin, La Follette, and so on. This is progressive. But as I say, they were tainted by this cultural populism, by this racism, by even an elitism that crept into their movement. But again, getting back to the pure definition of it, this, in my opinion, is not a good term, because progressive too often, in my opinion, becomes synonymous with ultra-left. And the ultra-lefts have a terrible heritage with, for example, the Weimar Republic, because they formed the United Front with the communists, which is something that Stalin did not want, by the way. And this is basically because the ultra-left, they wanted revolution. And the whole idea of Marx's communism is wrapped up in revolution. And this was not what the ultra-left really were about. This is not really what they're about now. So from a standpoint of ideological purity, Stalin didn't want this. Lenin wouldn't have wanted it either, except maybe to use them as the proverbial useful idiots, that is the ultra-left, to get what he wanted. Stalin did not want this. It had become a united front, though, that is to say, if the communists had united with the ultra-lefts, Hitler could never have taken power. What happened was insistence of the communists, of the KPD, attacking, saying the main enemy was not at all the Nazis, but it was the Social Democratic workers, or better yet, the Social Democratic Party leaders, because they prevented the workers from becoming revolutionary. And once again, you have a really basic philosophical problem here, and that was the main problem in the system. You can hear something similar today if you get a so-called progressive squad person, an ultra-left person. If you can catch them in an unguarded moment, they will pretty much tell you this very same thing. Various statements of the Justice Democrats, they'll say, oh, we hate the Democratic Party. We want to bring them down. We're only interested in the Democratic Party to bore into them from within and try to take over. This is similar kind of stuff, the same kind of stuff that will get you Trump, in the same way that the same kind of sectarianism back in the days of the Weimar Republic got you Hitler. And of course, there was Stalin, right? Stalin could never have made his order stick if the people in that party had not already been temperamentally inclined to be ultra-left anyway. Sectarian, fratricidal, which means that you knock off your own fellows. The ultra-left caucus has been called the fratricidal caucus because they knock off fellow Democrats. They're wreckers. So then we have these other terms. We have the Democratic Socialists of America. They're not socialist at all. They don't have a single socialist plank in their platform. Now, let me tell you my attitude about socialism. I do have an attitude about socialism, okay? And I'm going to tell you what it is now. Let's talk about Boeing, for example. Boeing is right now, they're in a tremendous crisis. Boeing is it's a national resource. It's a gem in terms of aeronautic and space exploration. And what should happen? I think it should be nationalized. Nationalize Boeing. And then we've got Starlink. That's one of Elon Musk's companies, which is needed by Ukraine and other friends of the United States. But he's giving it to Russia. He's giving it to enemies of the United States. And we can't have private citizens deciding stuff like this when and where Ukraine gets to use Starlink. This is what Musk has done. And he's also given it to the enemies of the Ukrainians, which are the Russians. And maybe other parts of this need to be nationalized. I'm talking about Musk's empire. And there's a third one, TikTok. Basically what happened, and this is from April 24th, Biden signed a bill that could ban TikTok. The Senate and the House passed it. And this is too important. Things like Twitter, things like TikTok, they're too important. They're national resources. They need to be nationalized. A communist Chinese company has been running it. It's need to become part of a state sector. And I ask you this, is the state sector unheard of? Absolutely not. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had the War Plans Corporation, he had the Synthetic Rubber Corporation, and he had others, because when you need products, this is the concept here, when you need products in sectors that are too slow or too greedy or too slow or too stupid to implement, well, the government just has to do it by itself. And that's just the way it is. Don't tell me that I'm violating Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, or David Ricardo, and that somehow I'm in violation. So, for example, we've got other things. Let's talk about healthcare. What does single-payer healthcare mean? I always used to recommend it, some others, that the proper term would be Medicare for all. Therefore, all, but it means Medicare for all who wanted Medicare for all, who wished to join it, so that the ultra-left, did they eventually realize that single-payer was a bunch of nonsense, and probably, so single-payer people started saying that Medicare for all, even though they meant the same thing, what they meant was that it would be Medicare for all, and you'd be coerced. And if you said, no, I'm happy with my current insurance, no, you're not going to be coerced. And I think that was one of the reasons why Bernie Sanders, and I don't really understand this, but I think it's one of the reasons, I mean, he's smarter than this. Elizabeth Warren is smarter than this. I think that's why they didn't get further in the 2008 campaign. And similarly, like I said, Elizabeth Warren, you're talking about Medicare for all as coercion and compulsion. No, that's completely wrong. Don't go there. And that's where we are. So again, the point of language is to convey the truth. Closing out this section, some may say, as Socrates argued in the time of the ancient Greeks, that the point of language is to persuade, but I would say better that the point of language is to identify and communicate what is true. And that's it. We've reached the end of the definitions. That was a really good show, if I do say so myself. I really enjoyed that. I hope you did too. I hope that you will come back because we will talk more of these things. And as I said before, it's crucial to have repetition on these things. I hope you will come back. Politics by Jake, we want to do this. We want to foster a knowledge in the populace with regard to these things and have some interesting conversations. And so, as I said, I hope that you will rejoin me in a week from now and we can talk some more about these things. Bye now.